up, everyone? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we will be reacting to the rise and fall of Daniel Ricciardo. This video was requested by one of my Patreon members. I actually saw it come out, like, because I've reacted to a few videos from this channel. Now it will like come up, the channel will come up in my like recommended videos. So I saw it come out the day that he posted it. And I thought, should I do that video? And then like the next day, one of my Patreon members requested it. But I'm excited to get into it anyway, because you guys know that, you know, I mean, I know he's not in F1 now, but I don't want to say he is my favorite driver. So I feel like it's rise and fall. So there's going to be some good bits in here. I'm looking forward to it anyway. So I'm just going to shut up and we'll get straight into it. Where are we? Singapore. Oh. Okay, we're jumping straight into the fall. Great. Way to, you know, plummet my mood through the floor. Oh no, not the clip of him just sat in the car. I can't.
It's the same old story. One as old as time, as cliched as it gets. And it started out like every other bloody story. Bitten by the bug at a young age, an irrepressible urge to just drive.
Well, I've got goosebumps already.
To dare to dream of becoming a Formula One driver. That is how it all started for Daniel Ricciardo. Although where he would end up today, the influence that he would have in and around the sport, I'm not sure that even he could have ever have known. No.
The influence that he has had on like the entire sport is actually crazy.
At Wanneroo,
like results aside, like just him as a person, he's like influenced so much.
In the home of racing in Western Australia, that his story would start. Although, while I can tell you about the story that's about to come, I don't know if I can tell you what it is about Italian Australians and racing. Ricciardo, Piastri, D'Alberto. Alas, you now know what to look for when searching for that next talent out of Kangaroo Land. His karting career was littered with achievements, so to speak. A CRK trophy here, a club championship there. But if you were to trawl through what's on paper, there wasn't much of anything to suggest that Daniel Ricciardo was going to be God's gift to motor racing. Nevertheless, in 2005, he would leave the karting world of
he just looks exactly the same.
Of car racing. He would compete in the Western Australia Formula Ford Championship, driving a 15-year-old Van Diemen chassis, which doesn't sound ideal, but there were plenty of other drivers on that grid who were driving the exact same chassis, and initially, those drivers were beating him. You might be able to chalk that up to experience, and that argument does have some validity, because as the year progressed, he began to ascend up the spectrum.
Oh wow, look at that.
A trait that would
went from like starting like 9th all the way to the top.
In order to get said career, Formula Ford and WA can only get you so far. And so this young fresh-faced kid, still looking like a casting for a young Adam Sandler, headed over to Asia to race in Formula
He's like one of those people who have like kept the same face,
2 wins in Thailand,
like growing up. You know how like some people's faces change quite a bit. His is exactly the same.
And this time, he would head to the motherland, Italia. He would run around that year with RP Motorsport. It wasn't exactly the bee's knees of motor racing teams, especially not compared to Epsilon, who had virtually all the Red Bull Juniors in their squad. That team had all the resources that they needed, and they were the benchmark. And yet, Ricciardo was pestering them, just kept hounding them the entire year, even if he didn't get a podium for the season, finishing the championship in 6th overall. Yeah, that doesn't sound spellbinding, but for those actually watching, it was like, whoa, okay, this guy's kind of good. And one of those watching was a dude who was about to have a major influence on his entire career.
I hate him. I'm sorry.
Darth Marco. It was around about this time that the Red Bull Junior team stopped being comprised entirely of Austrians, although not willing to stray too far from the path. An Australian seemed close enough, and this guy seemed the goods. So at the end of 2007, Marco approached the Ricciardos to ask, hey, do you guys want to not have to pay for racing anymore? I mean, we can do that, and we'll put Danny up in the best teams with the best engineers.
Why would you say no to that?
How's that all sound? I mean, who could ever possibly turn something like that down?
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. Sounds like a perfect opportunity to me.
He won the Western European Formula Renault Championship and
he won
of beating Valtteri Bottas for the Euro Cup title too. He would back this up the next year by winning the title in the British F3 Championship. The momentum was building for him. The snowball was getting bigger. People were beginning to see that this guy was backing himself up all of the time. There was some talk of Brendan Hartley and whether or not he was going to be the next Red Bull Jr. to make that step up to Formula One. But now the tide was turning. The narrative was beginning to swing. Now this guy was the talk of the town. Hartley?
Look at him, he was just smiling all the way.
For the time being, Red Bull's vacancies in Formula One were pretty well
Stop, why am I
sorted
getting
out.
emotional?
Toro Rosso
I need to stop.
already had Sebastian Buemi and Jaime El Jaswari in there, so everyone else was just gonna have to wait. In the meantime, Ricciardo was thrown into the World Series by Renault series that was run by Renault and was a series. At this time, this was considered the best championship to judge if someone was any good or not. Well, at least it was better regarded than GP2 was. I mean, my brother in Christ, the champion that year was Pastor Maldonado. Normally, series rookies don't win the championship. Normally, it does take time to wrap your head around a car that has more power than a South American dictator. But Daniel Ricciardo isn't normally.
What
Heading
happened?
into the last race of the season, Ricciardo
Did
had
he,
won
like,
4
win or
races
something?
and was the joint championship leader with recently jettisoned Red Bull Jr. Mikhail Aloshin. In a basic sense, this was a winner-takes-all scenario, and whoever finished higher in that final race would be the champion. And in third place, ahead of Aloshin, was Ricciardo, until a couple laps to go, when Aloshin slid past and took the title away from Danny Rick.
Oh,
Despite this
no.
excruciating defeat,
Are you kidding? I
watching
thought
his
that was
title
going
hopes
to be
fade
a
off
good
into the mist. It did nothing
title win
to
there.
hurt his Formula One chances. Now that Brendan Hartley was rightfully kicked to the curb, Ricciardo would be kept busy with Formula One reserve driver roles at Red Bull and Toro Rosso. His 2011 season comprised of another campaign in the World Series, but these plans would hit a snag. Before the first round of the championship, Ricciardo was kidnapped by Canadian pirates whilst mountain climbing in Saskatchewan and had to be subbed for that round by Lewis Williamson. When he returned for round 2, the results were
See the way my brain just stopped there? I was like, what?
Bag a win on the streets of Monaco, but was largely forced that year to be the
Oh no,
bridesmaid
look at that
in the
damage.
races. Meanwhile, fellow Red Bull Jr. Jean-Eric Verne was in a hard-fought battle for the title with yet another former Red Bull Jr. in Robert Wickens. Although, given how good Wickens was, why Marco ever cut that guy loose is beyond me. But then you remember that Marco almost certainly judges his drivers' performances based on their Wikipedia articles, so I guess I'll just go f myself.
I was going to
Nevertheless,
say,
he did
I've
see
learned
merit
to
in
stop
what
questioning
Ricciardo
his
was doing.
decisions now
Anyone
because they're
watching
all
knew it,
just...
even if that one win in Monaco was
I was
all
gonna
that he
use
had that year,
a
with
word
only
there.
one round to go in that year's World
ridiculous,
Series, Marco
I'll
phoned
say.
Ricciardo and told him, don't bother, you're not racing in the World Series anymore. Instead, I'm gonna send you to HRT for the rest of the year. For someone like Ricciardo, a prospective Australian racing driver, to hear the words, you're going to race for HRT, the initial response would have been, HRT, the best V8 supercar team in the land? Me drive for them? With all their resources, history, success, illegal engines, traction control? I wouldn't mind that. Give me all of that. Of course, that wasn't the HRT that Marco was referring to.
Oh.
He meant this HRT. A Formula One seat certainly sounds better than a V8 supercar one, but having to race for HRT, the Hispania racing team, is a hell that I wouldn't even subject onto my own worst enemy. They had a car that earlier that year
Is it, like,
couldn't
really
even
terrible?
qualify for the race.
Oh,
To be
couldn't even
pleased to drive
qualify for the
them
race.
is akin to voluntary castration. So why then did Marco press gang him into the team, especially given that there were no apparent rebel ties in sight? Well, ever desperate in need of money and keen to kick at least one of their drivers to the curb, HRT were only too happy to oblige. HRT was the antithesis of a shitbox, but of course, even the worst Formula One car of all time would still be amazing compared to anything you've ever driven
2011.
before. Ricciardo said that the F111 was actually pretty good.
See, look at that. From like 2011
But
to
of
now,
course, there are two cars in
looks
each
exactly
team.
the same.
Even if your car's crap, you still have a teammate to compete against. He would make his Formula One debut at Silverstone, driving alongside Tonio Liuzzi. Danny Rick did impress in the Young Drivers Test for Red Bull a few months ago, but
Did he?
this was different. This was a full-blown race weekend, driving for a team that was funded by food stamps, a car that had to be started using a teaspoon, and run by a consortium of people who had no business running a food stall at a county fair, never mind a Formula One team, and the lack of experience kind of showed. He was destroyed by Liuzzi that weekend, being half a second off in
Destroyed?
qualifying and finishing a lap behind him in the race. He also developed color blindness whenever the marshals started to wave blue flags at him, but at the very least, all of this was an improvement over the man that he had replaced, Narain Karthikeyan. Not that that's a feat worth writing home about. As the year drew on, Danny began to pick up the pace. Then he
Oh, did
started
he?
to out-qualify Tonio.
I was going to say, did he have like
Started
a
to
bad
outrace
start and
Tonio.
then
No
moved
one
up?
in the history of the goddamn galaxy was
That
ever
seems
gonna
to
make the
be where
HRT
this is
work,
going
but it
each
was
time
clear nonetheless
Danny does the
how much he was
championship.
progressing. as well as his potential.
From like the beginning of his
Something else
career
that
that we
people
just
picked
looked
up
at.
on was
It
his
starts off
personality.
okay, but then he
It
moves
doesn't
up.
make a driver go faster, but it certainly makes them more marketable. There's a lot of fakeness and blandness inside the European paddock. So to have someone like Danny with his infectious smile, fun personality, and pure racer mentality was just refreshing to see. It also helps contribute somewhat to his self-bestowed nickname.
I was gonna say
Honey
it
Badger.
helps a
Outside
lot
the
when a
car, he's
driver
cool
is
dude
actually
who you
like
would want to hang with.
actually has a
Track
personality
however,
and is not just some like PR robot.
Johanny. Come the end of the season, Marco had seen enough, and if his mind wasn't made up already, he decided then and there that Bueme and Al-Jaswari were going to be sent to the glue factory, and in their place, yeah, you get
It's
it.
Danny Rick.
Where better to score your first F1 points than at home, coming across the line.
Oh, I
in
love
ninth
that.
place. Ricciardo drew first blood in the teammate war at Toro Rosso.
His first
and created a
F1
memory
points
that would
at his
last
home
forever,
race.
Especially given Albert Park's aptitude for giving local drivers all the luck. Danny Rick never achieved a placing higher than 9th in all 20 races that season. Verne, meanwhile, had achieved 8th 4 times. It was the first year for the
He
both of them,
achieved
at least
8th 4 times.
Uncharted waters.
My
and
brain
all that
only
stuff,
just processed
so
that.
Second year together would be a more accurate representation, perhaps. They would be retained for 2013, but this time they had a carrot dangled in front of them.
Did they? What was that? Mark Webber to leave. Oh yeah.
Mark Webber would be retiring at the end of 2013, thus leaving the door ajar for a spot on the main Red Bull team, which had proven to be the dominant force of the last few years. To go to this team guarantees you a shot of winning, of driving a car that can prove to the world just how good you are. For Verne and Ricciardo, this year then would mean everything.
Yeah,
Verne
it
put on
would.
some good performances, achieving a 6th place in Montreal, the highest placing for a Toro Rosso car that year. But Rick just seemed to have an extra gear, finishing in the points far more frequently and placing ahead of Verne in the standings. He clearly did look like the better dude in that team, and the Red Bull
So
hierarchy
did he
thought so
replace
too.
him?
By early September, it was confirmed that Ricciardo would be the one.
I was
to
gonna say,
replace
I'm
Webber
sure it
at Red
was.
Bull
I mean,
for
I didn't start
2013.
watching
So
till
the easy part,
2017,
if you
so.
can call it that, was over. Now he was faced with a task that was sure to force a mass exodus of crap from one Spectre. He had just become the teammate of Sebastian
Yeah,
Vettel, the
what a
4-time
man.
reigning world champion, a man who had been scarily dominant from the start to the end of this era of Formula One. Someone who, leading into the start of 2014, had won the previous 9 races in a row. He was the big
Previous
dog in the yard
9
now. But,
races in
you
a
know,
row.
He wasn't exactly universally
Damn.
popular. Thanks to Team Order shenanigans
Feels
the
hurt
previous
after
year,
being booed by
Vettel was
fans.
not very well liked in Australia. He was seen to have screwed over Webber.
That's
stabbed him
crazy,
in the
like,
back,
how
1921,
people
and
can
all that
turn
jazz.
around,
Now
though.
he's got another
Like,
Australian for
him
a
not being
teammate.
popular
Was
back
he
then, but
gonna screw him
now,
over as well? The
like, when he had
locals
his
were
last
hoping for
year in
his downfall,
2022, the
and in qualifying,
amount
they
of
got
support
it.
he had was actually
Seb
unbelievable.
failed to get into Q3 for the first Grand Prix of this new era of F1.
Oh, no.
But what made it even more sweet for the 100,000
Let me
plus
guess,
that turned
did
up that
Danny make it
weekend
into
was what
top
happened
10?
next. Ricciardo did make it into Q3.
Oh, of course he
was
did.
fast in the lead up to it, and as the seconds whittled down in that session, Ricciardo went fastest.
He went fastest. Oh my god, okay. I thought he'd be like somewhere in the top 10, but he went
Rising to
fastest.
their feet, babies being flung in the air. The nation
Wow.
stood aghast as one of their own was
That's
about
a
to
sick shot there. Oh.
Here comes Lewis.
Okay,
Too soon, Junior.
great.
Alas,
Great.
it's not to be, but straight out of the gate, to beat Seb in qualifying like this, to put his car on the front row. in
Yeah,
less
that's
than
a
ideal
big,
conditions,
bold statement
all
there.
of that justified Red Bull's faith in the kid, and come race day,
To
he was
suddenly,
holding
like,
his own
top
as
him,
cars all
the
around him
full-time
fell
champion.
apart. He kept that Red Bull in second place, all the way to the flag, and became the first Australian to claim a podium in their home Formula One Grand Prix. Jubilation all across the landscape. The crowd had found their new hero, at least for a couple of seconds.
Oh, okay.
Not long
Disqualified.
after everyone's hopes up. Ricciardo was disqualified
Why?
from the race after having been found to be in breach of fuel flow regulations.
Oh,
This, along
it's
with
always
the
about
tricky
fuel,
weekend in
isn't it?
Malaysia, was a double gut punch for him. And maybe it was suggestion that Albert Park was just a one-off, that Seb had rediscovered his form, and that now this was actually where the form lay. If
Oh,
that
no.
were the case, then the rest of the season made no sense. As fast as
2016.
the reliability wasn't exactly their forte.
This is a
that
good year for
during
Danny.
the Canadian Grand Prix, both
I mean,
drivers
he
were
won a
battling
couple
car
races.
problems. Hamilton went out with brake issues. Rosberg had his own problems, but was still in the lead. That was until, with a handful of laps to go, his mirrors became full of Red Bull. He had just made an audacious move
here
on
we
Checo
go.
to get up into second place. But when it came to Nico, he wouldn't need such acrobatics. And with this, Daniel Ricciardo cruised home to take his first career win. And
Yeah,
the fourth Australian
wow.
in history to win a race in Formula One after Brabham, Jones, and Webberine. It was an awesome performance, and it was only the beginning. He won again in Hungary and then in Belgium. It wasn't just the fact that he won, it was the
I
way
love
in
it.
which he would do it. He was aggressive, but in a good way. Never really too excessive, and certainly never unfair. The last of the late breakers, sometimes
But I'm sorry,
a little too late,
my
but a
favourite
proper racer
race of all time,
nonetheless.
and my
Thanks to
favourite
all this
win of
gusto,
his of all
he was
time
still
is back
in
in
with a mathematical
2017.
chance of winning
Nothing
the
will beat
World
that race.
Championship, in part
I love
to
that
the
race so
format.
much.
And thanks in part to Bernie Ecclestone's completely rancid idea of having double points for the final round in Abu Dhabi, where he could use his momentum and experience to take Red Bull back to the promised land. But instead, the team would hit a rut. The
What?
Renault engines were lacking power, as well as a will to live, and thus left the team winning
as well as a
for the
will
first
to live.
time since 2008. He had some good performances, including challenging for the win in Singapore in a car that had no freaking right to win. But when the dust settled, there were no wins, no pole positions, and had actually finished behind Kvyat in the overall standings.
Oh,
Was
what?
that a fair reflection of their performances that
You
year?
know it's bad
No,
if you're
not
finishing behind
Doesn't
him.
matter decades later when YouTubers try and tell your life story? I mean... It was a relatively tumultuous time for Red Bull. They weren't bad, so to speak, but they just couldn't muster a fight against Mercedes or even Ferrari in that time. Over the next couple of years, Rick did pick up a couple of wins, and some pretty
Yeah, he did.
good ones at that. He was still the guy, so to speak. But in that
And the
time, he had
shoeies.
a new
Can't forget the
teammate in the
shoeies.
form of Max Verstappen. Max
Great.
was still young, he was still raw, but holy jumping shitballs. He was unbelievably fast from day
Yeah,
one.
he was.
To have your new teammate, who is still very much a teenager, win his first race with the team over 40 seconds up the road from you is a bitter pill to swallow. Never mind the differing strategies that almost certainly cost Ricciardo. People only ever remember who crossed the line first that day. And it wasn't him.
I loved their friendship though. It's
By
adorable.
2018, Danny was really hitting his stride. Not only was his place in Formula One beyond question, but if he were to leave here tomorrow, he would arguably be the best free agent that money could buy. He won in Shanghai with an assertive drive, whilst
Yeah.
others around him faltered. One of those dudes that faltered was Max. He may have been fast back then, but he was also as crazy as a rainbow trout in a car wash. The pressure was getting to him, and it was clearly showing. Even if he wouldn't admit it. For now, however, this didn't matter a hell of
say
a
that
lot
about him
to
now.
Ricciardo. Winning the teammate battle is
Sorry,
always a
too
good
soon.
thing. Doesn't really
Too
matter
soon.
how you do it. And for now, Daniel was still on top. And generally, this partnership was a harmonious one. Hardly any animosity whatsoever. But there were moments where things got
No,
strained.
are you going to bring up like Baku? Yeah. I saw it coming.
Baku, Daniel and Max raced hard for position. Honey Badger would range up behind and even occasionally pass on the front straight, but Max would just repass again. This back and forth continued for a few more laps. For us viewers, this was great.
Until
Behind the
they
wheel,
went
however,
into each
Daniel
other.
was gritting his teeth. Frustration was building. He knew he needed to get past, but how is he going to do it? Max was withstanding all the pressure right now. As you exhaust your options, you start committing yourself that little bit more, breaking deeper than you would think you would dare. And on lap 40, the inevitable happened.
Stop. I don't want to rewatch that.
Blame for this incident was hotly debated. Some said that Daniel just straight up rammed into Max's gearbox. Others say that Max moved under brakes and left Ricciardo, who was
He is
already
known to
committed
do
at
that.
that point, with nowhere to go. Whatever the case, it was wholly unnecessary in a time where Red Bull would need every point that they could take. And
Yeah, I was
both
gonna
were
say,
made to apologize to the whole team
bad
after
for
these
Red Bull.
gymnastics. Especially so when the Renault engines that they had at the time were being, to put it nicely, overwhelmingly French. Car failures in a multitude of events that year
Overwhelmingly
for both
French.
drivers severely hurt their weekends and their championship charge. To be totally fair, not all of these car failures were down to those rat poison powered pencil sharpener powertrains, but of the two drivers, Daniel did seem to be the most affected. That smile of his was starting to wane.
I hate that clip. It actually like tortures my brain. Sends me into trauma. Oh, now we're back onto the rise
Monaco
of
was a
Danny
place
Rick,
of bitter
talking about
memories for
Monaco.
Ricciardo. Just 2 years before, he was leading the race.
And the pit crew didn't have any tyres
Then he came in for his pit stop,
2016.
only to find that his pit crew were mid-game in a spout of musical chairs.
Yep.
Once they snapped out of it, gave him his tyres and sent him on his way, the race was destroyed and lost. The feeling of euphoria of driving around this paragon of one-lap magic was perhaps outweighed by the shadow of a lost win that would have cemented his place as a made man in the sport. There's always a chance for redemption though, and
he got it in 2018.
In 2018,
it was a beautiful win.
He was just in a class,
and his car was like struggling at the same time.
Into the barriers and would start last. Danny Rick was the only driver to dip into the 1 minute 10s and would start from pole. He was untouchable here, and he was a dude who made all mistakes. The race was bound to be his, and after leading into Sainte Devote, we all just kicked back.
He had Vettel behind him like the whole time.
Again, nothing would happen in the race.
Once he started having those issues.
For whomever was leading.
Losing power.
Yeah.
No, not
It was
this
not an easy win.
Not now. The challenge was on. Seb got closer and closer. We were all just
He
waiting
got
for that
very
lunge,
close.
No longer Nouvelle
I'm
chicane.
surprised.
He'd back off on occasion to cool the tires before attacking again. Eventually,
That he
however,
didn't
there
get
was
past.
10 laps to go, then 5, then 4. The gap to Seb was
Not mad about it, though.
wider. Lap 78 came
I'm
up.
glad that Danny
Green
won in
passed the
2018.
line.
And you know,
No one
when you
could
think
believe
about Monaco
what the hell they just
2018,
witnessed.
I'm sure
This was a
everybody
Herculean effort from Honey
who
Badger.
watches
It
F1 will
wasn't just
instantly
that he
think
was
of that
down
pool
under the
picture
power.
of him like
It was
diving
how he
into the
managed
pool.
situation did help grow the popularity of the sport tremendously.
Yeah, it
and
did.
Honey Badger was an instant favourite with these newer fans. So again, he
That's
could
'cause he's
earn
got a
some points
personality.
with the team
Nobody
news.
else is like-
Also, he wanted to be in a team that he could call his own. And so
I mean, a lot
it was
of them
announced
are
in August that for 2019 he would leave the Red Bull program
following, like,
behind,
PR and
becoming his own
everything, so-
man and joining the Renault team for whatever journey lay ahead. It was a ballsy move, especially given some of the problems with Renault PUs that he used that year. But hey, who am I to judge? So he had supreme confidence that 2020 would herald yet more improvements, better results, and eventually the first win.
Oh yeah, and he had
Ocon
Ocon on his team, didn't he? I forget
He had
that.
spent a year outside of Formula One, which was almost certainly going to hinder his performances, but that didn't mean diddly to Danny. He couldn't care less about his experience or whatever. People only care about how you stack up on paper, because the reality is that there is so much that we don't know and will never know
Yep.
that happens behind the scenes. So what goes out there in front
I
of the
always
world,
think, like,
that
what
matters.
if-
And this year, for
I'm sure a lot of
Ricciardo,
people do
it
this,
was
but,
no
like, what if he
exception, other than
didn't
Sergio Perez at
walk
Racing Point.
from Red
Danny
Bull?
Rick was arguably
Like,
the
where
best
would he
of
be
all
now?
midfield runners. That
I always
entire
think about
season,
that.
a constant presence in the
When I'm,
points
like, super
until
depressed.
2 at the Nürburgring and at Imola, with that Nürburgring performance being a particular standout. Granted, it did take virtually half the season before that Renault could be bothered turning up to work, but when it did, Ricciardo was dancing with it. Everything right now was trending in the right direction. He just looked so assured in that thing that really there was no reason to leave, which made his decision earlier in the year to defect to McLaren for 2021 just that little bit strange. At
Yeah.
that time, determining whether
I remember
McLaren
people
or
being,
Renault
like, so
had more potential
confused.
over the next few years was kind of 50-50.
Like,
I
he'd
know
only
in
been
hindsight
to
that
Renault
sounds
for, like, 2
ridiculous,
years.
But McLaren had made many promises in the years before this, and they hadn't gone
And,
back
like,
to the
Cyril
promised land
literally
like they
built
said
the
they would
team
be.
around
Stuff like
him.
the highly competitive fandom of the Honda deal.
So when he left, everyone was like,
Many
huh?
McLaren
Like, what are you
were even
doing?
gonna win it all again. On the other hand, Renault had Cyril, so pick your poison. Clearly, Danny liked what Zach Brown was plotting from his lair in his underground volcano, and thus put pen to paper to race for the Woking outfit.
And, I
in
mean, 2021 was
Now,
okay
with
for
that team armed with
McLaren.
Honey Badger to go along with the
It had
rising
its
star
ups and
in Lando
downs, but then
Norris, it
2022
seemed
was
that McLaren
awful.
had a match made in heaven. But then reality happened.
And they got their 1-2 in Monza.
For the vast majority of
2021.
that year, Honey Badger drowned.
Yeah.
Badly. He struggled to make sense of the McLaren.
They had some-
characteristics, especially
when the high was on,
under
it was
tracks with a high degree
top,
of slow corners were
but
proving
then
to
the
be his
lows were
kryptonite,
very
with
low.
the car pushing on entry and
And then
compromising his
22
exits.
came
Then
around
again,
and there was, like,
were
nothing.
Some tracks with slower corners where he was fine, and then there were some faster ones that he was slow on again. None of it was making any sense. The knock-on effects throughout the entire lap left him falling behind Lando, and questions began to arise as to what in the hell was happening to Daniel Ricciardo. I mean, he even started to wonder that too. Was it a setup thing, or was he washed? Every pro athlete has their decline. Was this the start of his?
But out of everything that's happened, I don't believe that he's washed. Like,
The season when
I...
the pendulum swung between Red Bull and
Because
Mercedes,
I
or more
am pretty
specifically Max
sure
and Lewis, the rest
that
of the
if
pack
you
could
put
only pick up the pieces.
Him in a
Literally,
Red Bull,
when these two titans
do
came
quite
to
well.
blows in Monza, the seas parted for those behind. The Temple of Speed.
Because when he did
played
that
to
testing in
McLaren's strengths,
Silverstone
it
and
played
they
to
put him in
Daniel's
a
as
Red Bull
well. For most
last
of that
year,
race, the McLaren
he
duo were
matched
lined
Max's
up.
time in
After
the Red Bull.
53 laps, they crossed the line,
Which is
to
why
take
they
the checkered
booted
flag,
Nick de Vries in the
and it was
first place,
Daniel
to put
that
Danny
crossed
there
that line first.
in AlphaTauri. So
After months of struggles, questions over whether he still had it, he had made his retort. For those who thought he was gone, he never left.
He never left,
He just
yeah.
moved aside for a
Got
while. But as much
goosebumps
as people
again.
wanted this to be a redemption story, it can't be one if this were to prove to be a one-off. And that's exactly what it proved to be.
okay, stop.
He fell back into the rut. Lando again was leaving him for dead. With the new regulations coming in 2022, it was kind of hoped that maybe this would breathe new life into his form. But it wasn't that either. If anything, it got worse.
Yeah,
it
it
wasn't
did.
just the lack of performance relative to Lando.
But also, we can all
just
agree that the
strange
McLaren was
mistakes
shit
that year. Just
over that year. Like
not that
2022, I
everything
remember
was
it
his
being
fault.
so
There were
horrible
times
for
where it was
both
kind of
drivers.
obvious that McLaren was siding against
Watching
him,
Lando at
such
the back of the
as
grid was
baggage
actually, like,
with the team,
heartbreaking.
intentional or not, leaving him hung out to dry. Not that it made his lack of good performances any more acceptable. Rumors about McLaren was searching for other options for that second seat. The underperformance is just not acceptable to a team who have plans for world domination. With no viable options left, the sobering reality had set in. For the first time since the beginning of 2011, the Formula One grid would be without Daniel Ricciardo.
Love it.
Only a few months after initially thinking that he may have been out of Formula One
He's
entirely,
back.
he was now back into the thick of things, only to be out again when he injured himself at Zandvoort. He was
That was so
momentarily
annoying
replaced by
because he
Liam
was
Lawson,
actually
although he
showing
would
good
return for the
results,
US
and then,
Grand Prix
like,
and continued on for the remainder of the year.
he broke
How were
his
his
arm,
performances
his
in
wrist,
that time?
so.
In general, pretty good. Well, better than De Vries was anyway, especially in Mexico, where he looked like $1 million, out-qualifying his
That's the other
teammates,
thing,
but
I sometimes
more
think, like,
importantly,
if
out-qualifying Sergio Perez in that
he
second
didn't
Red
break
Bull.
his
And the
wrist,
importance of
we
that
would have
is
never
all the
have
more
seen
crucial than you thought it
Liam
was.
Lawson
When he
in
returned to the
the AlphaTauri
AlphaTauri team
and
for
seeing
2024,
how-
the ultimatum
what
was
his
clear.
performance
That
is.
second Red Bull seat could
So then
be
I start
his
thinking,
if he proved
there wouldn't be
himself.
this whole, like,
I mean,
thing
God
about Liam
forbid,
Lawson now.
an 8-time Grand Prix winner has to prove himself. As the season
No hate to
started,
Liam
it
Lawson,
became
but you
clear
know, I
that,
just love Danny.
yeah,
So
this ain't going the way that the script is saying. What
It's
the
like
hell's
so
going
many
on?
what ifs.
Sure, that Miami sprint was a nice performance.
Yeah, you got P4.
Quintessential Honey Badger. But that was the one highlight amongst a myriad of poor ones. The objective was to basically leave teammate Yuki Tsunoda in the dust. But largely, it was Yuki who had the better of him. As the year drew on, the results were improving, but not enough. Marco was losing patience. And unfortunately, the door had begun to close on that second Red Bull seat. And the team that he was in, despite what was said earlier in the year, was still regarded as a junior team. Having Daniel Ricciardo in there is just weird, especially when it seemed that he just wasn't adding to the team like they thought he would. And
I
just
wonder
like it
if
was at
this is
McLaren,
like it
seemed
though,
like
and
the
he's
writing
like
was on the
finally
walls.
retired,
Days
or
drew
he's
on,
gonna do like
eventually
a
turning into
Fernando
weeks. The
Alonso and
atmosphere
like
was
come back
becoming
multiple
uncomfortable, and
times.
everyone was hating it. In the
I
paddock
like
and
to think
at
so.
home, we all knew what was happening.
Just
We
to
all
keep
knew what
me
was to come.
sane.
It all seemed to be not a matter of if, but a matter of when. On the eve of the Singapore Grand Prix, it was let known to Daniel that come the US Grand Prix in just
I
over a
literally
month's
remember
time, he wasn't
watching
gonna be racing,
Abu
that he would
Dhabi
be replaced
in
by Liam Lawson,
2022,
who was told 2 weeks beforehand,
like,
but to
crying.
Daniel, this was the first time
Call
he
me
would hear
over
about
dramatic,
it.
but I
Why
was
Red Bull
crying and I
elected
sat
not to
there
tell him went
thinking,
beyond anyone's
vowing
understanding,
to
but I
myself
guess
that I'd
that's
never
the
be
Red
able
Bull
to watch
way.
Danny
It's the
leave
same old
F1
story.
again.
One
And
is all this
then
time, as cliche
now we're here,
as it gets,
and he's not racing.
and it seemed to end like
And he's like
every other bloody story.
supposedly retired.
To be
Can't
dropped
do it.
like this. Direct, cold, callous, rancid. For now, however, there was still a race to be run. A time to
And he
take
should-
everything in
I
and
mean-
just remember you've made it this far. You've become an
You can
F1
say what you want, but
driver.
he should have had
You've
a proper
won here.
send-off, you know
You've
what
got
I
your
mean?
legions of fans, and you know why you've got them.
He's been in the
Time to
sport for
soak it
so
all in.
long.
At the end of the race, in a Hail Mary effort, he bagged the fastest lap of the race. Even though he would not score a point, it was a way to leave a stamp. News was not official, but it was obvious. Not just by the rumors, but how he was after that race. The body language, not least the emotion he displayed in the interviews after the fact. He tried to put on a brave face for the cameras, but
His
everyone
interviews were so
could tell.
sad.
Just a few days later, it was announced that his time in the team had come to an end. His Instagram post read almost like a farewell, not just from the team, but the sport as a whole.
Oh, I'm gonna cry. I need to stop.
So what exactly led to the downfall of Daniel Ricciardo here? Well, in some ways he did it to himself. He just couldn't adapt to the handling characteristics of the McLaren, and he just never managed to recover from that point on. Did he reach his decline? I don't know. It's impossible to tell, but it's
I don't
quite
think he
plausible
did.
that he did. That this just was his time. That is the nature of professional
I refuse
sport,
to believe
as
that he
brutal
did.
as it is. We understand it.
So
but
argue with me
it
in the
just
comments if you want, but I'm
sucks,
literally
because
not
Daniel
going to
is
listen
and
to you.
always has been a crowd favourite, well before the fame of Drive to Survive got to him. And it wasn't just because of his persona in the paddock, but what he did on the track, the last of the late breakers. A pure racer, a pure freaking racer. Never shy from a battle, always willing to go for the nuts.
Yeah.
Sure, we may
'Cause
see
all
him
of his
surface in V8
wins were
supercars in his
absolutely
native
epic.
Australia, and that would be great and all. But if this is how it all ends for Daniel Ricciardo in Formula 1, with the influence that he's had in and around the sport, at least he made his mark. One of his parting words was he'd hoped he'd left some amount of legacy in the sport. You did.
You did, yeah.
Fuck yeah, you did.
Oh, I'm gonna cry. I'm like still. It's like I'm grieving from it. I can't get over it. I'm still mourning. Well, there's so much to say about that video. It made me emotional. Like I said, the rise and fall of Danny Rick in itself, like the highs were so high and the lows were so low. But it was nice to like look back and go all the way from the beginning and throughout his career now. What he's going to do now, I don't know. Like I said, could he do a Fernando Alonso and like come back to F1 multiple times? Who knows? I've said quite a few times that I think he should. I feel like he'd love it, like going to NASCAR. Because like the only reason why he decided to drive the number 3 is because of Dale, and he like absolutely loves NASCAR. So I wonder if he'll do that at some point. I hope he does that at some point, because if he's not going to be in F1, I'd like to see him in NASCAR. But yeah, what's going to happen with him, I'm not sure. I think he's just enjoying the retired life at the moment. Well, I'm sat here crying about him. But yeah, thank you to my Patreon members for requesting that video. And with that being said, if you have any other videos that you'd like me to react to, drop them in the comments and working my way through everybody's suggestions at the moment. If you did want to check out any of my other socials or become a Patreon member and get early access to videos like this or top priority review suggestions, then you can do all of that down below. And if you want to become a member on this channel and receive exclusive perks, you can also do that by hitting the join button down below. But I hope you enjoyed today's reaction, and I will catch you next time for the next one. Bye!